Free agent frenzy is right around the corner for the New York Rangers and the entire NHL. Today, we're going to look at two more potential targets for the Blueshirts going into unrestricted free agency. We're also going to be taking a quicker look at new assistant coach Phil Housley. All this and much, much more on today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers.
You're Locked On the New York Rangers, your daily podcast on the New York Rangers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, Blue Shirts fans, to episode number 857 of the Locked On New York Rangers podcast. I'm your host, John Chick. Just want to thank you guys, as always, for making Locked On New York Rangers your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube, and we are, of course, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So, again, wanted to talk about a couple more potential UFA targets for the New York Rangers, and kind of a new one today because Blake Wheeler, one of several players who has now been bought out by his team, in this case, the Winnipeg Jets. This makes him a free agent. And, you know, we've talked about this in the past, but by the very nature of a buyout, obviously, this is someone who isn't really coming off of a career season, although with Blake Wheeler, I mean, certainly not a career season, but he's still putting up pretty good numbers. It's kind of a situation where it seems like the Jets just want to go in a different direction. There have been reports about that not exactly being the best locker room in the league over the past handful of seasons here. Blake Wheeler, was stripped of the captaincy going into this past season. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. But of all the buyouts, this is the first one that your eyebrows kind of go up a little bit, and you look at it and say, you know, this actually could be a fit. This is a player that will get seemingly at least a decent amount of interest from around the league once free agency begins. We've had a couple of other buyouts recently, as I mentioned, you know, Patrick Nemeth and Zach Kassian from the Coyotes, and there's not really a whole lot of interest there, at least not from me. I mean, Kassian, I guess maybe you could look for a inexpensive contract and a potential bounce back candidate, but even when he was at his best, it's not like he was like a stellar player. And Oliver Ekman-Larsson from the Canucks never really had any interest there either. Wheeler, though, it's interesting. Again, you could maybe talk yourself into this if you're a Ranger fan or really a fan of any team that's looking to add somebody via free agency, somebody that's had some success in this league. But with all that said, that's not to say there are not any red flags when it comes to Blake Wheeler. For starters, and this surprised me, he's actually 36 years old, and he will be 37 before the season starts. I thought Blake Wheeler was like 32, 33-ish, you know, somewhere in that ballpark. So he's actually a couple years older than I would have guessed. And obviously, whenever you bring in a player who's starting to get up there a little bit, there's inherent risk that comes along with that. And again, he's also been part of what's widely been considered, again, one of the more toxic locker rooms in the NHL, in the Winnipeg Jets. I don't know a whole ton about it. I haven't followed it as closely as I'm sure some Jets fans have. If Blake Wheeler were to become a member of the Rangers, I'm sure we'd talk to Harrison from Locked On Winnipeg Jets and just kind of find out what the situation there is. But again, to kind of backtrack to something that I was talking about a second ago, he was named the captain of the Jets in 2016. And then a few years later in 2018 was a finalist for the Mark Messier Leadership Award. So at that time, it would at least appear on the surface that everything was going swimmingly for Blake Wheeler as the captain of the Winnipeg Jets. But then, as I mentioned, stripped of the captaincy going into this past season, and the Jets actually chose to go without a captain this last year. And at the end of the year, Blake Wheeler bought out of his contract. Now, it did seem like Blake Wheeler, you know, I went back, read some old articles about that whole situation with Wheeler losing his captaincy. It seems like for at least publicly, you know, at least during interviews, for the most part, he handled it pretty well. I mean, said he was surprised and a little bit disappointed, but said that he would continue to be one of the leaders of the team. And again, we don't know what goes on behind closed doors at all times, but, you know, maybe that was true. Maybe it wasn't. You know, the Jets, they ended up making the playoffs this past season, but a team that's just kind of been a little bit directionless and just not really sure if they're coming or going, if we're being quite honest here. But, you know, I also mentioned Blake Wheeler's age a couple of minutes ago. And again, I feel like his buyout was not a case of like, oh man, this guy, he's damaged goods, he's washed up, he's this, he's that. Again, he had a pretty solid season this past year, and we'll get into his stats in just a second here. But again, this seems like a situation where the Jets are a team that is just in badly need of a shakeup. And I think, you know, obviously buying out Blake Wheeler probably is in line with that. You know, they're kind of going in a different direction. I would imagine they maybe want to move in a new direction where, some of the young players feel a little bit more empowered. Maybe they move some of the veterans out of that room. Again, some of the reports that I was reading about Blake Wheeler losing his captaincy, there's a belief that the younger players and the vets have not exactly gelled all that great in that locker room. So maybe it's a situation where the Jets are kind of looking to clean house and give the team to some of the younger players. I mean, again, I don't follow them closely enough to know that for sure. That's just what I'm gathering, reading some of these articles that went back to when Blake Wheeler was, losing his captaincy. But once again, that is not to say all these things that I'm talking about here. It's not to say that Blake Wheeler is completely washed or that his play has just fallen off a cliff here. We'll go back in time here, look at his career stats, and then we'll kind of zero in on what he did this past year. So 16-year veteran, number 5 overall pick back in 2004 by the Arizona Coyotes. They might have been the Phoenix Coyotes back then, but regardless, the Coyotes never actually played with them. Ends up playing his first 3 NHL seasons with the Bruins. And then you'll never guess which team Blake Wheeler was traded to by the Boston Bruins. Maybe some of you remember, it's not the Winnipeg Jets. Technically, he was not traded to the Winnipeg Jets. He was traded to the Atlanta Thrashers. Yeah, the Thrashers were still around. The half season that he played with the Thrashers turned out to be their last season in the league, and then they became the Winnipeg Jets. After that, obviously relocated in the whole 9 yards there. But that gives you an idea of just how long Blake Wheeler has been in the NHL and just how long he spent with the Winnipeg Jets organization. He's been there ever since. But yeah, in 1,118 career games with the Bruins, technically the Thrashers, and also the Jets, 312 goals for Wheeler, 610 assists. So 922 points in 1,118 games. He's a plus 65 for his career, averaging 1827 of ice time per night, 691 block shots, 1,320 hits. So he will play some physical hockey. More on that in a second as well. And 536 takeaways against 502 giveaways. And in the playoffs for his career, 65 games, 10 goals, 35 assists. This past season, I feel like we should really zero in on that because, obviously he was bought out and, naturally it's kind of like, okay, what went wrong there? How bad was he that he needed to be bought out? And he really didn't have a bad season. 72 games, 16 goals, 39 assists. So 55 points in 72 games. He was a -3, averaged 17 minutes and 3 seconds of ice time per night, which is actually the lowest for him since 2010, 2011. And that's back when he was on the Bruins. So the lowest time on the ice per night for Blake Wheeler as a member of the Jets. And then in the playoffs this past year, only 5 games. They lost in the first round to Vegas, who went on to win the Cup. But in those 5 games, 2 goals and 4 assists for Blake Wheeler. So again, this is not someone who's completely falling apart, who's just about to age out of the league or anything like that. He was an all-star in 2018 and 2019. So he was an all-star as recently as just 4 seasons ago. And I realize, that can kind of be considered a long time in the NHL. But once again, this is somebody that continues to be at least a fairly effective player now and was an elite player as recently as 4 seasons ago. One obstacle here, as far as the Rangers potentially trying to sign him, unlike most players that get bought out, I don't think Wheeler's in a situation where he's going to have to settle for some bottom of the barrel contract offer. Like Blake Wheeler, some of these other, buyout players, the players that were bought out, or even players that are candidates to be bought out, they are in a situation where, they might be lucky to stay in the league. Some of them, they'll probably hang around, but a lot of them are going to have to settle for that 1 year, $775K deal, or, 2 years at the league minimum. $775K is, of course, the league minimum. And, they're going to be lucky to just hang around. They'll have to take whatever they can get. Blake Wheeler, he's not going to get the same kind of contract that he's coming off of, but he will get, I think, at least a decent amount of money. He's still putting up solid numbers. And in a free agent class that doesn't seem like it's all that deep, doesn't seem like it's really all that star-laden. If you're going to get bought out, this might be the season to do it because there aren't a ton of, incredible options available for these teams that are looking to, obviously improve their roster once free agency begins. As far as what Blake Wheeler might command, I don't know. It's always so hard to predict these things. Maybe he's going to be 37. So I get the feeling maybe a 2-year deal and maybe $3 million per season, $3.5 million per season. I don't think he would get 4. That seems like it's a little bit of a stretch for somebody who, was just bought out and had a solid season, but certainly is not the player that he used to be. If it gets as high as $4 million, I think the Rangers basically have no chance, and there's no way that they should reach for him at that price. If they could try to snag him for 2 years and $3 million, maybe it becomes an option, but I don't know. It's really hard to predict the market for some of these players. And honestly, even 2 years at $3 million might be a little bit steep for the Rangers at this moment, considering the fact that they're going to have to trade Barclay Goodrow, it would seem, to give new contracts to Keandre Miller and Alexi Lafreniere. I don't think they want to let them go. But again, if you just forget about the price for a second and just kind of look at the individual, this is the kind of player that I think the Rangers could use. Big bodied player, 6'5", 225 pounds. He can win you some board battles. Fairly physical player. I could see Wheeler. He's the right wing. He plays right wing, so I could see him potentially being the right winger on the Panarin line. I think those two would kind of complement each other pretty well. They are kind of both, facilitators and playmakers, and neither one. I mean, Wheeler's got a good shot. I wouldn't really call him a sniper, though. He tends to rack up the assists. But that could work. You have Blake Wheeler in there doing some of the dirty work on the Panarin line. We'll see. Again, I'm not so sure that he's going to be within the Rangers' price range, but he's certainly a name to keep an eye on as we barrel toward free agency here. Definitely looking to see how all the chips fall once free agency begins. It's a complete free-for-all, and definitely looking forward to covering the Rangers, obviously on the show when free agency begins. And Blake Wheeler, again, if the price is right, somebody that the Rangers, I think, could and probably should and probably will at least do their due diligence on. I'm not so sure he's going to be the next Ranger, but it's a name that's obviously got a lot of recognition and somebody who just recently became available. So I think it at least worth discussing. We'll see if the Rangers make a play for Blake Wheeler. Going to keep everything rolling in just a second. I want to talk about another free agent that will be on the market, somebody that I believe in the past has been tied to the Rangers. It seems like every offseason or, every trade deadline season, there's at least some speculation that he could become a Ranger. We'll talk about him in just a second. But first, we got to let everybody know that today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by eBay Motors. For a championship team, it is all about making sure every player is a perfect fit. It's the same when it comes to your vehicle. Every part needs to fit just right. So the next time you need parts and accessories, head to eBay Motors. With eBay Guaranteed Fit, you can be sure every part you need fits right the first time around. Just add your ride to My Garage and look for the green check to know the part will fit or your money back. Because just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game when you shop on eBay Motors. And with over 122 million parts to choose from, you will be back in the game in no time. After all, it's easy to bring home a win when the right parts are guaranteed. Get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices on ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. All right, we just want to thank you guys, as always, for making Locked On New York Rangers your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. And for the everydayers, definitely stick around for the rest of the week. Exciting times here. We're going to be talking a whole lot about the NHL draft. That's obviously upon us. Going to be talking about the draft and players that the Rangers could end up selecting either in the first round or a little bit later in the draft. We're going to do that in our first couple episodes for the rest of the week. And then obviously the draft will happen. We'll react to everything that goes on with the Rangers and talk a little bit about the players that they drafted. Definitely looking forward to doing that. So definitely stick around for that. To keep the focus on free agency for the time being, though, we're going to talk about another free agent, and that's going to be Gustav Nyquist, 33-year-old right winger. As I mentioned just a second ago, Nyquist is one of those players that it seems like there's always kind of some whispers that maybe the Rangers might be in on a player like this to either trade for him or, sign him in free agency or whatever the case might be. One of those players that always just seems to be at least somewhat available. He spent the last couple of seasons on the Columbus Blue Jackets, and obviously they haven't had a lot of success. So even before he was traded this past season, I believe even the year before at the trade deadline, his name was getting mentioned, even though he had an additional year on his contract and he wouldn't have just been a pure rental. But, in a recent episode, I got to say with Nyquist, he's not like the player or the type of player that I think the Rangers desperately need, but he's somebody that I think is worth talking about due to the fact that he could give you a little bit of depth scoring. There was a recent episode where we talked a little bit about two players that I really like for the Rangers in free agency. They are Garnet Hathaway and Noah Chari. They play kind of a similar game where just really hardworking players, really strong on the forecheck, very physical. They can give you a little bit more secondary scoring than you might anticipate. With Nyquist, not really a physical player at all. I mean, to begin with, he's only 5'11", 180 pounds, and doesn't really have a similar skill set to Hathaway or Achari. But with Nyquist, he's somebody that gives you a little bit more scoring, gives you a little bit more offense. And there's been times over the past couple of seasons where we as Ranger fans have kind of lamented what occasionally happens, and that is kind of a scoring drought as far as secondary scoring is concerned. At the beginning of last season, I remember it was basically like the big five on the Rangers, Panarin, Kreider, Mika, Trocheck, and Fox. That was obviously before Tarasenko and Kane got here. And, a lot of us were saying, and it was true for a while, if it's not one of those five putting the puck in the net or, dishing out assists, the Rangers aren't going to score. That's what it felt like for a while at the beginning of this past season. Gustav Nyquist is somebody that can come in and I do think give you a little bit of secondary scoring. He's somebody that you could get by with him if he's like the ninth forward in your top nine. He's somebody that I don't think you would put him on the fourth line because he just doesn't play that style of hockey unless you just want to add some scoring to the fourth line. Then I guess you could do it. But he's somebody that, again, plays right wing. Seems like the Rangers are going to be thin there for this upcoming season. And again, as sort of your ninth forward of the top nine, Nyquist would be all right. And to kind of look at his resume here and what he's done in the league, 11 years in the NHL with the Red Wings, Sharks, Jackets, and Wild, 703 games for Nyquist, 175 goals, 253 assists, so 428 points in 703 games. He's also a minus 13. He has averaged 16 minutes and 54 seconds of ice time, 399 hits, 253 block shots, 346 takeaways against 323 giveaways. One knock that you have to put on Nyquist, and maybe this is, again, the lack of physicality and the lack of size. Hasn't really been a playoff performer. 71 games in the playoffs, only 5 goals and 21 assists. So 26 points in 71 playoff games. He did do pretty well, all things considered, for the Wild this past year in the playoffs. They only played 6 games. He didn't have any goals, but he did have 5 assists in those games. And I wanted to also kind of hone in on what he did with the Columbus Blue Jackets in parts of the past 3 seasons because he put up, pretty solid offensive numbers there, despite obviously the Blue Jackets, frankly, just not being a very good team. So 3 seasons or parts of 3 seasons with the Blue Jackets, 200 games, 43 goals, 74 assists. So 117 points in 200 games. Just over a half point per game for Nyquist during his time with the Blue Jackets. Not eye-popping numbers, of course, but again, playing for a team that just frankly isn't any good. So again, secondary scoring. That's kind of the name of the game when you're talking about Nyquist. He's not going to put up these gaudy, eye-popping numbers, but he will kind of, play a supporting role for your team if he, is on your team and presumably, a third-line type player. And then this past year, to just kind of really zero in on that, 51 games between the Jackets and Wild, 11 goals, 16 assists, 27 points. It was a -9, 1737 minute or time on the ice per night, 41 hits and 30 block shots. And as far as his contract is concerned, coming off a 4-year, $22 million deal with the Blue Jackets, I think that's definitely an overpayment for Nyquist, and I don't think he'll get that much in free agency whenever it begins. It's also worth noting that he's had some shoulder issues in that time, missed the entire 2020-2021 season. Something that I found interesting, though, and this doesn't necessarily dictate exactly what's going to happen in free agency, but Nyquist was one of those players. His contract was going to run out, and if you're the Blue Jackets and you're buried in the standings, it would make no sense at all not to move him before the deadline. So they moved him, but when he was traded to the Wild, all the Blue Jackets got in return for Gustav Nyquist was a 5th-round pick. Now, on one hand, you look at that and you say, man, that is not a lot of cachet for a player that, at one time was considered, one of the better up-and-coming players in the league. Obviously, he's kind of plateaued and has just kind of stayed around third-line level of production pretty much throughout his career. But that also tells you the fact that he could only return a 5th-round draft pick, that he could probably be had at a fairly inexpensive price come free agency. So that's something that, maybe the Rangers, they could get him at a little bit of a discount and, bring him in at a fairly reasonable price on a fairly short contract. We will see there. Something else that I like about Nyquist, though, as far as, just what he brings to the table, good skater, and he's got some speed. He's pretty fast. Rangers, they aren't what I would call a slow team, but you think about their forwards and it's like, okay, how many guys are like true burners out there? How many have like great speed? I think of Kreider, I think of Filipino, and after that, I'm kind of stuck. Again, there's nobody that's really slow, but, Mika, he's got good speed, not great speed. I'd say the same thing probably for Panarin. Kakko and Lafreniere, I haven't really been dazzled by their speed either. I mean, there's other examples. Trocheck has decent speed as well. But again, there aren't really a lot of burners for the Rangers, and Nyquist can move out there. So he has some speed, and he's almost somebody that I look at in the vein of like a Michael Grabner, where not like an excellent all-around player, but one thing that they bring to the table is good skating and good speed. And I know this is kind of a football term, but somebody that can kind of like take the top off of the defense, somebody that can gain the blue line in a heck of a hurry, make the defenseman turn around, and just get into the offensive zone with some momentum. I think Nyquist is somebody that can do that. So again, not like phenomenal all-around player, but someone who one of his best assets is skating and speed, and somebody that can be had inexpensively. Kind of again in the vein of like a Michael Grabner, the season and a half that he spent with the New York Rangers. So in conclusion here, as far as Nyquist is concerned, you hear the name, you don't really get overly excited. It's kind of like, Nyquist, all right, I guess maybe kind of. But you got to remember, the Rangers are dealing with very limited cap space here, and they're not going to be able to bring in, flashy free agents. Not that there's a ton of them in this year's draft class anyway. But again, if you can get Nyquist, if you miss out on, say, Garnet Hathaway and Nola Chari, there's other teams that kind of overpay for them, and they're just out of your price range. I think, given the position that Nyquist plays, right wing, and given the fact that he does give you some speed, and given the fact that he can be had on a pretty inexpensive contract for not a ton of years, Nyquist, again, the phrase that I keep using, the ninth man in your top nine. He could play that role and do okay with it. It's not somebody that gets you overly excited, or at least not me, but somebody that could fit in there and, maybe do a decent job for the Rangers in a depth role. So yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it as far as Nyquist is concerned. Like I said, I prefer somebody in the vein of a Hathaway or an Achari, but if you miss out there and you want to, just add some depth scoring, Nyquist, I think, becomes an option at that point. Going to keep everything rolling into just a second here. I want to conclude today's episode by talking about Phil Housley, who will be joining the Rangers coaching staff as an assistant coach to Peter Laviolette, and we will do that in just a second. All right, let's go ahead. Keep everything rolling here. 59-year-old Phil Housley added as an assistant coach for the New York Rangers. I'm not sure if it's like officially official yet, but that's been reported that he will join the coaching staff for the Rangers. We talked about Housley a little bit at the end of yesterday's episode. What is sort of hone in on him at the end of today's episode here? For starters, we can kind of look at his playing career, which was absolutely phenomenal. Drafted number 6 overall all the way back in 1982. He played in 1,495 games with the Sabres, Flames, Jets, Caps, Blackhawks, Blues, Devils, and Leafs. Scored 338 goals, had 894 assists, a 7-time All-Star, member of the Hockey Hall of Fame. I want to say 2015 was the year that he was inducted. Was the youngest defenseman in NHL history to score 30 goals in a season. He was 20 years old when he did it. Never won the Stanley Cup. Did make it to the finals with the Capitals in 1998. They were swept by the Detroit Red Wings that season, back when Detroit was in the Western Conference. As far as his coaching career, he was assistant coach with the Predators from 2013 to 2017. So he was on Laviolette's staff while he was there. He was also on the staff the year that the Predators made it to the Stanley Cup final. He has coached Team USA to the gold medal at the 2013 IIHF World U20 Championship. He also was the head coach of the Buffalo Sabres for 2 seasons in 2017-18 and 2018-19. Didn't really go all that well. Went 58, 84, and 22, and he was fired after year 2. Housley, one of many, many, many coaches that just hasn't been able to do a whole lot with the Buffalo Sabres. I realize, they're starting to turn things around a little bit. Got close to the playoffs this past season, but it's obviously been a struggle for that team for a very long time there. Became an assistant coach with the Coyotes in 2019, remained there until 2022 when they parted ways, mutual parting, however you want to phrase it. While he was there, he was the team's defensive coach and also oversaw the power play. And I got to say, I really like this coaching staff that the Rangers are putting together under Peter Laviolette. You've got, a gritty, defensive-minded forward in Michael Pekka. He's going to hold guys accountable. You have to believe somebody that won the Selke twice, finished in the top 5 for the Selke in 7 consecutive seasons. You've also got a Hall of Fame defenseman in Phil Housley, and we just went through his resume, and I like what he brings to the table. You've got a younger coach in Dan Muse, only 40 years old, but got a couple of championships on his resume. Won a championship on the world stage, won a championship at the college level, as well as the USHL as a coach and or assistant coach. And you've got the best goaltending coach in the world in Benoit Allaire. And all of them, except for Allaire, they have prior experience working with Peter Laviolette. And I think that's a good thing, too. There's obviously familiarity and some comfort there. And as I mentioned, I think that the Rangers are putting together a heck of a coaching staff here. And the other thing I want to mention, I talked about this when Laviolette was hired, but I like the fact that he's being given, or seemingly being given, complete free reign to bring in, whoever he wants to join his coaching staff and be his assistant coaches, whether it's Laviolette and the Rangers or any coach on any team. I think that coaches should be given that flexibility, that option. If you bring them in to be your head coach, then let them bring in their guys so they can do their job to the best of their ability. So that's nice to see as well. To kind of wrap up today's episode, I want to mention a couple of quick things here. I got to give a shout out to Zinthi on Twitter. Zinthi messaged me the other day and wanted to know what my thoughts were on Tyler Toffoli. The Calgary Flames have reportedly made Toffoli available via trade, and Zinthi wants me to talk about Toffoli, and I'm hoping to get to him in a future episode. For right now, I'll give you the quick version. I like Toffoli, like him a lot, but he's got 1 year left on his deal at $4.25 million. After that, he's a UFA. I think that price is just too steep for the Rangers. And even if you trade Barclay Goodrow, and whether Goodrow is part of a different trade or he's part of a package that the Rangers would give away to get Toffoli, you're still losing more than $600,000 in cap space. If you move Goodrow's contract and you bring in Tyler Toffoli, Toffoli makes more than Goodrow, about $600,000 more. So you're not really saving any money. You're actually losing money, and then you still have to re-sign Keandre Miller and Alexis Lafreniere, who are both restricted free agents this offseason. So I just don't really see a way that the Rangers can make that happen. There could be some other moves that could be made. You never know. But yeah, I don't think it's in the card. I do like Tyler Toffoli, but I just don't think it's in the cards for the Rangers to make that happen this season. But we'll talk a little bit about him in a future episode. Some other news. We kind of had a feeling that this was going to happen, but the salary cap has been confirmed that it will be $83.5 million for this upcoming season, just a $1 million rise from this past season. Again, there had been speculation that that would be the case, but now officially official, that will be the salary cap for this upcoming season. And the one last thing I want to do here is call for stories of Derek Stepan. I saw a couple of you guys DM'd me, a couple of comments in the YouTube section for this. Try to either email me or send me a DM on Twitter, because in the YouTube section, it could get lost in the shuffle very easily. We're not going to do this Stepan episode for a while. We've still got the draft. We've still got free agency, and we're going to focus in on that, while that's happening on Locked On New York Rangers. We're saving the Stepan stories for part of the, the slower parts of the offseason. And basically, if you've missed previous episodes, what I'm looking for you guys to do, send me your stories, who you were with, how you reacted, and, just how you felt when Derek Stepan scored in overtime, Game 7 against the Washington Capitals. We did this with Artemi Panarin last season, and heard some really cool stories from some of you guys. So if you got anything, again, DM it to me on Twitter or email it to me. That's a lot better than the YouTube comment section for this. But that will do it for today, guys. Once again, if you'd like to get in touch with this podcast, please send an email to lockedonnyrangers@gmail.com. Once again, that is lockedonnyrangers@gmail.com. Definitely give us a follow on Twitter as well, @LO_NY_Rangers. Once again, that's @LO_NY_Rangers. And definitely subscribe to Locked On New York Rangers YouTube channel. Thanks again, guys. I will see you next time.